Hi guys, so today we want to look at something called imperfect information and the notion of something called asymmetric information. First and foremost, really super important to understand how and why information helps us when it comes to consumer decision making. And this all falls part of consumer decision making. And ideally, as consumers, we want the best available information to us so that we can make the optimum decision, the best decision in our interest. Because at the end of the day, guys, as consumers, we want to satisfy ourselves with the decision of consuming the good that we are going to consume, right? We want total satisfaction, total kind of utility to increase, and our pleasure to be gained to the maximum level from that particular decision that we make. But we can only make the best decision based on the information that is available to us. So ideally, in the ideal world, guys, we want perfect information to be available to us so we can make the best decision. But guess what? In the real world, unfortunately, we don't have that perfect information, and this is known as asymmetric information. And first and foremost, it's really important to understand asymmetric information as a definition, if you like. And asymmetric information, guys, is when one party of a transaction has more or better information than the other party in the transaction. So, i.e., the seller usually will have more or better information than the buyer, and the buyer there will be a disbalance between the seller and the buyer because the information is not equal, it's not the same. And it's happened to me as well, and probably happens to you, or has happened to you. Think about it. Think of an example, perhaps, that when you go to buy something, right, the seller somehow has more information than the buyer, and that's possibly because they want to hide their imperfections, like the defects of that good, versus the buyer. Buyer, obviously, they want to know all the information that they can, as we said before, so they can make the perfect decision. But the seller may not want to disclose those defects or those imperfections in order to sell the good. And this was firstly kind of coined or kind of developed by George Akerlof, the famous economist who actually won the Nobel Prize for economics in 2001. And he looked at something called the market for lemons. And what he kind of analyzed and assessed was the car market, the second-hand car market, whereby he realized from his assessment that, you know what, guys, in this second-hand car market, there was a lot of imperfect information, a lot of asymmetric information that was going around. And that's usually because the seller will have more information than the buyer. So there could be a defect of the car, for instance, that was not disclosed, and the buyer doesn't know any better. They go and buy the car, but then later they find out after the transaction had finished, later on, there was problems with the car, right? There were defects that they later realized, and it leaves a bitter taste if you think about it. When it's happened to me as well, I've bought a few cars myself, and I've realized after buying the car that actually there's a problem with it, right? There was something that I didn't realize when I initially bought the car. So as a result, it left a bitter taste, and that's where the idea of lemons comes in, whereby by its nature, lemon is bitter in its taste. And when you realize something after buying it without knowing that information was there, you kind of feel a bit let down, you feel a bit bitter in your experience. So, George Akerlof realized this, and he phrased this idea of bitterness in the transaction, i.e. the market for lemons. And it's not just the car market. You can think of other markets as well, many different markets whereby you buy something, you later realize, you know what, I didn't know about this. Perhaps the seller did know and they didn't disclose that. And therefore, this leaves you in a situation where you're not completely satisfied. Your utility has not really increased that much in terms of what you really wanted, i.e. that perfect situation, that perfect transaction, so that you can gain more satisfaction from it. And really interesting, actually, in terms of a real world example of the market of tobacco and cigarettes, particularly in the early 1900s, what happened was, people, the population, society were led to believe that cigarettes actually had a lot of health benefits, believe it or not. For instance, obesity. People used to think, by consuming cigarettes, guys, your obesity level comes down potentially. And this was like all phrased and coined forward to the people, and they of course bought loads of cigarettes and the consumption of cigarettes were to be increasing. And then later did they find out in the 1950s from medical research that actually leads to cancer through the consumption of cigarettes. So that's completely imperfect information, asymmetric information to the people. And of course, thereafter, people realize, you know what, actually consuming cigarettes is not a good idea, not a good idea at all. So yeah, asymmetric information affects us in our daily lives. You can probably think of tons of examples that maybe it's happened to you. Maybe now you realize, actually, you know what, when I do buy something, I need to think twice. And this is where George Akerlof also actually phrased the idea and a question of a scenario whereby a person selling horses, why would you want to buy their horses? And this is something that he kind of famously coined. If a person is selling their horse, why would you want to go and buy that horse? Question mark. And in that notion, I mean, not literally horses, but think of the car market. If someone is selling a car, why are they selling that car? Ask that question. If you want to buy something, particularly in the second-hand market, if someone is selling something, why are they selling that? I think this is something maybe to consider going forward when you buy stuff, going ahead in the future, right? Maybe ask that question, why are they selling it? Are they selling it because they want to hide certain defects that you don't know about, but later then you find out? So it's always wise to pose the question, why are you selling that for? And with that, guys, imperfect information affects us on our daily lives, particularly for transactions and consumers. But yeah, with this idea, hopefully you can be better, well informed, and I hope it helps.